2004-2005 Will, Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Speaker Series. My name is Liz Fair, and I'm a professor in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies here at the University of Richmond. Now, this is a special year for the co-sponsors of the series. Women Involved in Living and Learning Program, or WIL, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Program, or WGSS. And for those of you who are wondering where this name came from, it's the former Women's Studies program at the University of Richmond. 2004-2005 marks the 25th anniversary of both programs at the University of Richmond. That's a quarter century of commitment to the intellectual and leadership development of the young women here, as well as the education of the campus and the community at large about gender and diversity issues. The theme of the series of this anniversary year is Interrogating Limits, Pushing Boundaries, Artists, Academics, Activists. The 7 events in the series celebrate artists who are also activists, academics who are also artists, activists who are also academics, and some who are all three. Tonight's speaker is Marie Wilson, whose talk is entitled Closing the Leadership Gap, Why Women Can and Must Help Around the World. Ms. Wilson will be introduced shortly by 2 of our students. I'd like to make a quick announcement of another speaker, our next speaker, Okima Christian Dark, who will be speaking on October 6th at 7 p.m. in Jepson 118. The WIL WGSS Speaker Series has always tackled difficult issues for which there are no simple solutions or even common understandings of the underlying problems. The speakers we present are our starting point to discussion. We ask you to continue the discussion by taking the ideas, criticisms, and questions to class, to the library, to anywhere for future research, future discussion with your friends and others in your community. Tonight, I wish to thank the many sponsors of this year's speaker series. And I'll be reading, I think, a partial list at this point. We want to thank all departments and programs that have contributed to this. WIL, WGSS, Quest, Gottwald Speakers Board, Student Affairs, Cultural Affairs, English Department, Booker Chair in Religion, and West Hampton College. I also would like to thank a number of people who helped put this series together. Dr. Elizabeth Brunner, a member of the English faculty and the former coordinator of WGSS, Dr. Holly Blake, director of the WIL program, Dr. Elizabeth Sheehan, assistant director of the WIL program, and Ms. Karen O'Connell, administrative assistant of the WIL program, whose years-long effort has made this series a reality. Following Ms. Wilson's talk, there will be a half hour for questions and answers. We'll be using the 2 microphones set up here this evening. Please hold your questions until that time, and then use the microphone provided so everyone can hear your questions. At the end of the evening, Ms. Wilson will also be signing books, which are on sale near the entrance. And with that, I am pleased to introduce you to Ali Emmerich, who is a junior Jepson major and part of the WIL House Cabinet, is that correct? Okay. And Nicole Cavadini, a senior chemistry major, who is also a member of WIL and part of WIL's elected leadership committee. Thank you.
Marie Wilson, former president of the Miss Foundation for Women, current president and co-founder of the White House Project, author of Closing the Leadership Gap, Why Women Can and Must Help Run the World.
Co-creator of Take Your Daughter to Work Day, mother of 5, an advocate of women's issues for more than 30 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored and delighted to have Miss Marie Wilson here with us tonight. We are amazed by all of her accomplishments. She is a wonderful source of inspiration for all women as she encourages equal representation of men and women in leadership positions in all spheres of life. She presents a powerful point in her book, Closing the Leadership Gap, that states, "Women populate half the democracy. We should occupy half the positions of leadership, both for gender equity and because women, a natural resource, should be mined for energy."
For 20 years, Ms. Wilson held the presidency of the Miss Foundation for Women. She stepped down from her presidency this summer to fully devote her time to the White House Project, which she co-founded in 1998. This nonpartisan organization is dedicated to advancing women's leadership across sectors, enhancing public perceptions of women's ability to lead, and encouraging entry of women into leadership positions including the presidency. The White House Project's newest initiative is Vote, Run, Lead, which will encourage more than 25,000 women to vote in the 2004 election, and will recruit and train 1,000 women to run for political office.
Other honors and accomplishments by Marie Wilson include receiving the prestigious Robert W. Scribner Award for Creative Grantmaking in 2002, as well as the Leadership for Equity and Diversity Award for Women in Philanthropy. She also received an honorary doctorate of community service from Drake University, where she previously served as Director of Women's Programs.
Ms. Wilson has also received recognition for her accomplishments in public service. She became the first woman elected to the Des Moines City Council as a member at large in 1983. 10 years later, in 1993, New Women magazine named Ms. Wilson one of their People of the Year. And that same year, she co-authored Mother-Daughter Revolution. She also served as an official government delegate in 1995 to the United Nations 4th World Conference on Women, held in Beijing, China. And on a personal note, this summer I was excited to pick up Marie Wilson's book, and I found out she was going to speak. And after reading the first couple of chapters, I encouraged all the Will students to read her book, and I found out yesterday that's what Allie did.
That's true. And without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to warmly welcome our Will WGSS speaker tonight, Marie Wilson.
I haven't had a kind of dyad introduction there. It's really quite good. Now I just wish one of you would come up here and we could do this more. Join me for the talk. I'm thrilled to be here. I really feel better when I'm closer to people. If I were Oprah, I would have cars to give you, but I don't. So I just suffice with whatever information. I'm pleased for several reasons. I'm pleased because it's always good to be on a college campus. I'm sure some of you, like me, the first person in your family to go to college, and so I have enormous respect for what education means and what a value it is, and I've never lost that. So I'm always happy and comfortable because this is a place where I learned a different thing in the world, and where I got to tell my mother and father how grateful I was for them making something possible for me they never had. But I'm also glad to be here for Will's anniversary, because it represents what we're talking about tonight, which is a real intentional focus on women's leadership. I like the name Will, too, because one of the things that I think we have to have in this country, if we're going to have enough women to lead, is will. I mean, will is what it's about, having a political will. So I'm thrilled and really have enjoyed already speaking with people who are in the program, and the professors as well. And I know you have many things to do, so I'm delighted you came to hear about women helping run the world. I'm pleased that some of you think that's possible, because I think soon we will have women running for the presidency. I think soon we will have many women in many countries, we already do, who are leading. And so we have to think about strategically how that happens. As I said, I was for 20 years the president of the Ms. Foundation for Women. And that inspired me about the White House Project, because I got a chance through the Ms. Foundation to fund women all over this country who have created what are the domestic violence shelters, the rape crisis centers, the economic development programs, the micro-enter programs, the job creation programs, so many programs and policies that I began to think of the women in this country who we funded as the government in exile, because they were the women really doing what I thought government should be doing. And it was quite wonderful, because many of these women would never call themselves feminists. I mean, they were just out there doing what needed to be done for their community to create jobs. And we would go in, and after a while, we'd say, well, I think maybe you're a feminist. And they say, you know, maybe we are. But it was wonderful, because it was a really definition by what was happening. And after a while, I thought, you know, those women were also fighting 200 pieces of progressive legislation a year. And some issues, like the issue of choice, oh, why in the world shouldn't they be creating things inside the halls of power instead of always knocking on the doors of power? And a second thing happened, and that is take our daughters to work. I was very privileged to be, I don't know, did any of you participate in Take Our Daughters to Work? You were taken, oh my God, okay, I'm glad to be here. You were taken to work. That was an accidental kind of success. And I'd like to say that in terms of leadership. There are a couple of things before I get started that program illustrates. The first thing is that when we went out there and started looking at what happened to girls and how we could sustain girls' strength and resiliency, and we're looking for a way to do it, it took us 2 years of experimentation and outtakes. If you've ever seen movie outtakes, you mean outtakes that you don't show the world failures, before we came up with an idea that we thought would work. And it was fascinating. By then, we took the idea out to some of our colleagues, and a couple of them said, "That's kind of stupid," and a few of them said, "Oh, this is really kind of the craziest thing I ever heard." But we said, we'll just experiment with it in New York. And it got into Parade magazine, which has a great circulation, and people started to read about it in Parade. And I learned something very important in terms of how you make change, and that is that when we did Take Our Daughters, what we did was we hit a nerve in this country about something people wanted to change, but we couldn't have exhorted them to it. We couldn't just research them to it. We gave them something to do about it. It was one act. They could take their daughter or somebody else's daughter to work. And it was stunning. We exhort people to do things, but we don't give them anything to do. But I learned a great deal about leadership because we were going to do it in New York, and it got all over the country. So we had to deal with where we were. I mean, we couldn't say, well, excuse me, we didn't mean to do it all the country. We'd like to cancel that. So there were actually, after we started it, we had no money. We had 7 women and a fax machine, quite frankly. I mean, it was like, pay no attention to the people behind the screen. People would call. We had the answering machine in somebody else's house, actually. It wasn't even in our office. So people would call and they would say, yes, I'd like to speak to the workplace coordinator. And we'd say, oh, yes, hold on just a minute. This is the workplace coordinator. How can I help you? It was fascinating because with 7 people in a fax machine, we actually created something that I think really changed the lives of girls and boys in America, because no program in America has called as much attention to boys as Take Our Daughters to Work. Interestingly, because it not only changed for girls, but people started asking, what about the boys? And now the country for the last 13 years has been looking at what about the boys as well. But I learned again about leadership. I mean, sometimes you get pushed into stuff that you weren't exactly expecting, and then you just have to grow into it quite quickly. And we were privileged to do that. I also had girls who wrote me, I should say, too. And they started writing after a few years. And I started to notice that more and more of them said, I think I'm going to be the President of the United States. I thought, well, isn't that cute? That's very nice. And then they kept coming in. And I finally got this one letter that just blew me away. It was the young woman who had gone to work with her mother, who worked for Olympia Snow in Maine. And she wrote me this letter and said, Dear Miss Wilson, she said, I went to work with my mother at the White House, and I saw that there were all the pictures of men on the wall. There's never been a woman president. And she's just a little bitty 8-year-old, I think, at the time. She said, and I wanted to tell you, I've been practicing my piano, and I've been doing my math, and I think that I will be the first woman president. I want to do that. And I thought, well, that's great. And she signed it, and my name is Alexandra, which means leader of men. I will make a great president, Miss Wilson. And I kept up with Alexandra, by the way. And Alexandra is probably going to be a president, so, watch out for her. But I realized that we were raising expectations for our nation's daughters that really were nowhere near being met. So I thought this combination, why don't we just do something that starts to ask, not just about women's leadership, but why aren't we looking at women in America, the oldest democracy, so to speak, as a place where women can lead? And so was born the White House Project. And I should tell you, it's folks like you that made us call it the White House Project, because we got young people your age together. And it was fascinating because all the women, the young women said, don't say anything about women in the title. Because we were going to call it Why Not a Woman? They said, no. So we finally ended up with the White House Project having nothing to do with the White House, although every now and then when you leave your name on Marie Wilson with the White House Project, they think you're the White House, they call you back right away. So it has a little advantage sometimes, depending on who you're calling there. Sometimes it doesn't. What this is about, of course, and what the book is about, is why we need to really, why at this time in the life of our country, particularly, when things are more complicated than I think they've ever been in my lifetime, more complicated in terms of how you run a company, more complicated in terms of how you run a country, where you have a spread of a kind of terrorism and war that we have never had to deal with in America. Why in this time, shouldn't we use all our resources? As the old suffragette Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, it's a wonder the Republic has done as well as it has when it's never used half its resources, you know. We haven't used half our resources in America. But what would change things, I think, more than anything, is to bring a critical mass, at least a third, probably half, of women into every sector of this country to lead alongside men. A very diverse mass, a representational mass of race and region and in this country into leadership, because that would change the product. That would change the process of government. That would change how men could be, and it would change how women could be. And I feel like every time I say this, I must start with one caveat, which is when you're for women, it's my experience that people leap immediately to the fact that you are against men, which when you're working for women is such a bother, you know, because truly to be for women is to be for men. And I have a fantasy that I keep putting out in the world with the hopes that some group will do it, and that is I want some kind of ad campaign, television, print, I don't care what it is, but it has all of the things in this country that have changed for men for the better. I mean, basic training in the Army is so much better because women are there. You know, men can now take family medical leave, and there are now different working arrangements because women are there. It has changed how men can be with fathers, with children, etc. But I want it to be all these good things, and there are many more that men know about. All these good things that have happened to men. And across the bottom, it has this tagline that says, "This opportunity was brought to you by feminism." You know, because I think if ever we get something like that, you know, something that just says, this is a good thing for everybody. So that's the bottom line basis of what we're dealing with. Well, why doesn't it happen? I mean, this seems pretty normal. Why doesn't it happen? First of all, it's not that people don't want women to lead. It really isn't. We have research everywhere that shows that people are very interested in having more women at the top of most companies, most industries that you're asking them about. If you ask people, should we have a woman president? Anywhere from 76 to 92% of people say, sure, that would be great. Now, of course, they have a little caveat. They always say, I feel that way, but I don't know about my neighbor. Now, we started to call it the neighbor project, because if we just get the neighbors on board, we'd be all right. But of course, you pollsters know what that means. I'm holding out, but that's me, my neighbor. But the truth is, people mostly want that. Right before we put the book out, we decided at least to ask about politics. How many people, you know, think it would be good to have more women in politics? And 75% of people say, yeah, I think it would be much better. So it's not that they don't want us there, but in this country, because we have this idea of ourselves as a fair country, people think, and this will be good for all you women out there, they already think you are leading. They think we run everything. It's a fascinating thing. Now, if you dig underneath, you find out they don't know that, but they think we're all leading, which is hard. You're trying to change something people think has changed. And my fantasy of how this happens, too, is some of you watch maybe the State of the Union address, you know, when the president stands up and says, you know, here's where we are, blah, blah, blah. And you look on the television, and I always love it. It's such a major show. But what happens is you look out there, and there are all these blue suits, you know, all these blue suits. And you have about 14 red and green suits with the women. And you aren't colorblind because, you know, with a sea of blue coming at you. And I think they look at those suits and they say, look at all those women, they're everywhere. You know? But how many women actually are, what's the percentage of women in Congress? I know some of you know. What's the percentage of women in this Congress? And we're asking, let's just start with this, we're asking Iraq to have 25%. What do we have? No, you're close. 14. Who said 14? You have just won a Vote Road Lee t-shirt. A very beautiful t-shirt, I must say, for you. All right. Very good. Yeah, they're 14%. Don't be embarrassed. It's great. It is a great t-shirt to wear. I can promise you, it stops traffic. It makes people have married on this t-shirt. People have in the world in terms of women's political representation in the United States. We are behind not only the Scandinavian countries, but South Africa, Somalia, amazing countries that, Pakistan, I mean, we are behind countries that have not come near so far sometimes in terms of women, but they have more women in political life than we do. We are actually, in terms of women CEOs, they've got about 6 CEOs at the top of the Fortune 500. With regard to parity on boards of our country, the publicly traded companies in America, we have about, it takes us 25 years to get 25% women on those boards, parity. We have 9 women governors, a record, an absolute record. But the governorships are the pipeline to the presidency, so 9 does not a pipeline make. We are actually behind in terms of women in leadership. So that's a story that people don't know. They are not there. They die. And by the way, what I have found is that when you tell people we're 57th in the world, that's when you get their attention. Because this country can't stand to be behind. Don't they? I've noticed how competitive we are. So what do we do about that? Well, there are a couple of things. We have to talk to people about why it matters. We've had several programs called Why Women Matter. Well, why does it matter, you know? Does it matter that we have women in greater numbers in these places? Yeah, it matters because we have research. We're an educational institution. We have research, actually, that shows after 30 years of looking at legislatures, and by the way, the state legislatures are one of the worst problems in America because we are stuck at the same level of women in our state legislatures in this country, even after term limits, at somewhere between 20 and 22% average on the state legislatures. This is not good. This is not good in terms of the pipeline. But when we talk about it, we need to remind people that we know that when women sit alongside men in these governing bodies, and this is true for our country, this is true for the European Union, they make a difference. What do they do differently that we need? One, women think outside the box. No woman ever got anywhere thinking inside the box, you know that. But they think outside the box. They think differently about how to get things done. The second thing is they build consensus, a good thing, but most important, and there are many things, most important, women bring new people into the process. Women reach out and bring more people into the governing process. They do this in companies, they do this in countries, you know, and it connects people to the work. It connects people to democracy. It says your voice counts. I want to hear what you think. And that matters. There's nothing needed more in this country right now than people who say your voice matters, what you think matters, because that's the cynicism that keeps people from voting and being a part of democracy. So that matters. It matters to have a, and I should say, by the way, that I'm not an essentialist. It's not like I look at you and I say, oh, you're a woman, you're so much more collaborative and nurturing, and, you know, no. It's about women. It's like Ronald Heifetz at Harvard would not like that. And Ron Heifetz at Harvard says about leadership that women have had to lead without authority. In other words, women don't have projected authority onto them, you know. We see a woman and we don't automatically see somebody with authority. Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State, could walk into a room and still be asked to serve the coffee because it wouldn't be seen as the Secretary of State. This happens to women leaders all the time because their authority isn't projected. Women have had to bring people together to having authority. And so that is why we have learned to bring more people in. So women matter. And it's the same thing in business, by the way. It's like decades of research about how the ways women have learned to lead are the ways that companies now need leadership to occur. Again, leading across silos. I find it fascinating, though, that in the last 2 decades, most of the management literature that talks about this has been written by men. Not by women, but by men. As a matter of fact, it's a man named Tom Peters, who we ought to make an honorary woman, because he has written so much about why we should have women. It's interesting. How many of you have ever heard of emotional intelligence? Oh my gosh, this is a well-read group. EQ. Dan Goldman, he talks about what's the kind of intelligence is emotional intelligence. The first time I ever heard him talk about this, I went to hear his lecture, and I raised my hand and I said, Dan, that sounds a lot like women's intelligence. And he said, Marie, I'm trying to sell this book. You know, what's happened is that if it's about women, it doesn't sell. If this kind of leadership that I'm describing is associated with gender, it doesn't sell. And that's a problem for you, women as a leader. And it becomes a problem for men too. So what do we have to do? Okay, let's go to what are we going to do to change it. Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to commit ourselves to numbers. This country likes to think that people lead because of a meritocracy. They're just good and better and best. You know, if you're just smart enough and everything you can do, pull that bootstrap stuff. We all know that. But it isn't that. It's systems. There are things that allow people to emerge as leaders and to lead differently. And part of it is numbers. You have to have numbers. You can't have one woman. You have to have several women. You can't have one person of color. You have to have lots of people of color at the table because that allows people to be authentic. Let's look at what happens when one woman leads. When there's one woman, she's seen as gender, right? So we're waiting for her to be, you know, a mother and nice and, again, all those lovely things. But what does one woman leader at the top of a country have to be? Oh, my God. She's got to be man enough for the job. She's got to turn out to be a woman in drag, you know, or a man in drag. She's got to be, you know, tough. And so you end up when people say, well, why should I have a woman? She's got to be just like a man. Well, if there's one woman, almost invariably she will be. So we have to get lots of women. You have to have more women who are in leadership so that we move beyond gender. The reason we are doing this is not so we can get women for women's sake, because we've had men for men's sake for years, and that hasn't worked either. We need to have women because they bring an agenda, and I want to see what your agenda is and your agenda is. I don't want to be stopped by your gender. But when there aren't enough people, then that's what happens. It's like Sandra Day O'Connor said when Ruth Bader Ginsburg came to the Supreme Court. She said, finally, it wasn't the justices and the woman. We were 9 justices. What a relief that is, not to have gender. One of the pieces of research that I most have enjoyed at the White House Project is the first one we did on women running for governorships, because we looked at how they were treated by the press. You know, if one woman's running, it's fascinating. We call these our hair, hemlines, and husband study, because they are about, when there's one woman, how is she seen by the press? It's not like when Jerry Ferraro ran 20 years ago for the vice presidency, and they were very open about saying, well, Jerry Ferraro has nicer legs, we should have a, you know. We don't have that kind of stuff going on anymore. It's the subtle stuff, because it's not putting enough attention on what she's saying, and what are her statements, and how is she coming across that way. It's like, what is she wearing, and what are her children like, etc. And so if you have one woman, then the press, men and women, will go in through the lens of gender and talk about her green suit, etc. Poor Elizabeth Dole came down to New York one time, having changed her position on gun control. And she came to New York, and they said Elizabeth Dole had the audacity not to wear a black suit in New York. I mean, you know, this whole thing about focus on gender. I happen to know this one personally, by the way, because I was a politician at one point. And I ran for office against 11 men. And I actually, you know, was one woman, and there weren't 2 of us, so they could compare and contrast us. It was just me. And all the time, somebody would come up to me after any speech, and I would think, boy, that was a good speech. Somebody's coming up to really tell me something great. And invariably, they would look at me and say, you have great hair. And I would be like, terrific. Yeah, that's great. And my campaign manager had said, God, if you were bald, we'd lose. I mean, this is all people are looking at, Marie. Thank God you have this hair. And I have decided there's political hair. I mean, Ann Richards has political hair. I have political hair. You know, it's hair that doesn't move, you know, whatever it is. Clinton has political hair. Kerry does not have political hair. Bush has political hair. But it's interesting. It's just that focus. And walk around with Hillary Clinton at any conference, you know, and people are like, ooh, 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 they're dealing with her hair. They don't do it anymore. She has a hairdresser that does that, I think. But really, this focus on gender and how you look because of gender or whatever, when you have 3 and 4 women, when we have more of you in leadership, when there are rich diversity of you in leadership by race, by region, and who you are, then we will go beyond the gender and we will be able to hear your agendas, which is why, again, you're there. Well, what's the other thing we have to do? You have to change the perception of women as leaders. Because again, as I said, leadership is not automatically rejected. When we see women, we don't see leader. Those are 2 different things. There are many studies we could talk about. But what we have chosen to do as a way to go with that is actually to go through culture. Because the culture is where this stuff is stuck in America. The cultural ideal of women in America is what? What is it still? No matter how many women have gotten into the workforce, it's wife and mother. That's the cultural ideal for women. And so it's in the culture. You have to go to the culture to change it. Well, what do I mean by that? You know that more people actually voted for the American Idol than voted for Gore. I mean, that's where people are. How many of you ever watched The Apprentice? Yeah. I mean, this is what we are watching, right? This is what we are doing. This is where we are learning. The culture shapes our beliefs. So we have to change it. I'll tell you who taught me this. It was a woman named Wilma Mankiller. Wilma was the chief of the Cherokee Nation. I don't know if you've ever heard her speak. She's just a terrific woman. And Wilma moved to New York 20 years ago when I moved to New York. And I walked in the room and I couldn't believe it. I mean, men were just pasted along the sides of the wall. And I was like, that's interesting. I wonder what this is about. And I went up to somebody and I said, what is it? Wilma Mankiller is here. Okay. She doesn't look armed, you know. It's fine. But Wilma stood up to speak, and she knew exactly what was happening in that room. So she stood up and she said, I just want to assure you that my real name is not Mankiller. And so everybody, particularly the men, okay. And then she said, it is White Mankiller. Which is probably her real name. But she knew where people were. She understood where people were in the room, and she knew that that had to come off, and so she just did away with it. But she knew where people were in her community, and she brought water to her community, the Cherokee Nation in Carolina. And I said to Wilma, how do you do these things? She said, well, I start where people are. You start over here, and I begin where people are. I go to their community, and I find out where they are. And in our world community, in our country, people are watching The Apprentice. People are watching television. People watch movies and films. And so you have to go to those things, and you have to change those films. You have to have women not just as leading ladies, but as leaders. 24 men have played the president on television or on a film. 24 men. Maybe a couple of women. Glenn Close in Air Force One. Remember the tough Glenn Close who saved the president, the vice president? There's no way. Dennis Haysbert. Any of you watch Dennis Haysbert in 24? I'm the only 24 fan here. I mean, Dennis Haysbert is changing how an African-American man can be president by that role he created. If Dennis Haysbert goes to Washington, people say, Mr. President, because he is changing how people can be, who you can be and be the president. You have to have those changed. So we go and do that. The first woman I talked to about making a film, I'm proud to say, eventually made The Whale Rider, because she was committed to changing how girls are seen as leaders, and she did it in a very beautiful way. I have done this outrageously, I must admit, because I am a disgrace to the feminist community. Because I decided one day when Mattel would not give me money to fund my project that they should, I turned around and I said, well, you won't give me any money, just make that doll into a president and make that stupid dream house into a White House. Then she'd have something to dream about. I was not feeling kind, but they said, that's a good idea. So I became the mother of White House President Barbie. Now, I was not, she came out in all races, I'm glad to say. I feel good about that. I made that happen. I was not able to change the first time she came out, that thing on the back of the box that said, doll cannot stand alone. I thought that was pretty bad for a president. Doll cannot stand alone. But she had a Bill of Rights. And she had stuff about how you run for the office, had the best website in the world on how you get to be the president. And as one of my friends finally said, because it got girls to talk about the presidency, it's what girls were touching and seeing, whether you like it or not. There are 13 Barbies naked on any little girl's floor at any point, but most of them are princesses. So the president is a good thing. And an academic friend of mine, Kathleen Hall Jameson, who wasn't too fond of the idea at first, said, well, I went over and I gave my niece one, and I went over to her house and I said, get that doll down here. She said, and get Ken down and get all those other Barbies down. She said, we're gonna play, let's call a joint session of Congress. Which I thought was funny. But it made me feel better. It's the only doll that you call a joint session of Congress. But if you're going to change things, you have to start where people are. And whether you like Barbie's little body and bust and everything, that is what little girls touch. And so you can start by making her into a kind of power that will go way beyond her body at a certain point. And it has got girls to talk about it. We did a Girl Scout Miss President patch for the same reason, because again, this is where people are, begin where they are. Finally, you have to have the political will. And we have not, we have not whipped up political will in America. In South Africa, after the women had fought alongside men during the apartheid movement, the men were still going to take power without involving the women in South African Parliament. So the women said, we were fighting alongside you, we bled alongside you, we died alongside you, we will take seats, please. And the men said, no, I don't think so. And the women said, okay. So they gathered all the women together, all across different groups, and they said, we are going to tell the men that we will not vote for them, for the African National Congress, unless they let us have 30% of the seats. Can you imagine? So they gathered together and said, we will have 30% of the seats. And they said, well, I said, yes, because we will vote against you. They have 30% of the seats. Because the men knew. I mean, it's political will. It's saying, we want this. The women of India have done this. They've crossed their continent and gotten 1.3 million constitutionally into local leadership in India, because they have the political will to do it, and they're still fighting. They think it's important to have women in. They think it's important. They think it matters. It matters to have women there. It matters. Okay, so what are the things that I kept running up against, and then we'll have questions and answers. Hopefully you have more answers. It's hard. It's the hardest work I've ever done to talk about women in leadership. We're much more comfortable talking about women as leaders. But talking about women as leaders is not as easy. Like, oh my God. If we want to do this, there are other things that I've run into. I got interested in rereading Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, that at the end of the book, the A that stood for adultery at the beginning of the book, at the end of the book I'd forgotten that most people thought the A stood for Abel. Because the woman had lived beyond the A. The way she lived, Hester Prynne, had lived beyond what letter marked her. And so I got to thinking about what I learned in the White House Project through our research about the A words that really get to women and are used against women, and how we can live beyond them. And the first one is about authority. Again, this idea of being seen as authors, agents, people who can command, who can say, do that. By the way, when women lead, what they often do is, would you please do this? And that's fine. But there's sometimes to say, do that. And how do women have the authority, the command? Well, we did two things that were fascinating. One is, we counted the number of women on the Sunday shows. Now, why did we do that? What do the Sunday shows have to do? I bet you all don't watch the Sunday shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, really, they're pretty boring most of the time. But you know what? The Sunday shows tell you who are authorities in America. The Sunday shows tell you who's going to be the president, vice president. The Sunday shows tell you who can lead. The Sunday shows bring you right into my living room and say, oh, I get close to you, I might vote for you. The Sunday shows confer authority. And that's why we counted. So for 6 months, we counted how many women made guest appearances versus how many men made guest appearances. Well, before 9/11, there were 9 to 10 men every Sunday making a guest appearance to every one woman. That seemed unfair. After 9/11, by the way, there were 13 men making guest appearances right after 9/11 to every one woman. And you know what? Women led the 3 most prominent subcommittees in the Congress on terrorism, and they never appeared on the Sunday shows. So we counted them, and we just took them in and took them out to the folks who were doing the Sunday shows and said, this is very curious to us, because it doesn't let women be seen as authorities. Why does this happen? Well, first of all, they said it happens because the White House census certain people, and that's true. But the second thing is they do have choices, because guess who we counted over and over again? John Edwards. This was in 2000, John Edwards. And we said, you had John Edwards on the show all the time. And I said, why is that? And they said, well, I think he was being mentioned as a vice presidential contender at that time. And we went, well, I don't think so. He wasn't. Guess what? You made him a vice presidential mention. You made him one by having him on the show week after week after week. And finally I said, why? I mean, you have to tell me why. I want you to hear the juice. Are there any juicy women in the world? You know, are there any women with juice? It's fascinating, you know, who we see. And John Edwards, we don't have a woman John Edwards right now who was on the Sunday shows where people say, ah, there's somebody with juice. That person could be a vice president. So these things matter. And the women in Congress were just so delighted. They took it out to everybody and said, look what happens to us. And then they started training themselves. But we are now trying to get women on these shows. But we have to make each other visible. We have to make each other visible. You have to be a Sunday show for her. You know, you have to actually make her visible. I'll tell you one way you do it, and that is when you introduce somebody. I'm so interested. I have a friend named Sally Bernard, and she is amazing. Every time I'm at a meeting or something, she'll go up and she'll start introducing me. And she'll say, I want you to meet Marie Wilson. Marie is blah, 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 blah. And when she finishes, I'm thinking, God, I want to meet me. I mean, she does it in a way that so authorizes me as a person. It's a gift. It's a gift. But for women, if we do that with each other, or if men do it for women, right? It's a great thing because it's like authorizing you. And we have to authorize each other. That's how people get authority. The other research we did in this area that was stunning was we decided we would look at how women were able, well, let me just say this. When women run for Congress or something where they're going to be in a group, nobody worries too much because we're in a group with people and we'll be okay. But when we start running for executive leadership, like to be the governor, people get worried. That's why there are only 9 women governors. Like, oh, I wonder if she could be tough enough on crime, and I wonder if she'll know Homeland Security. I mean, you know, then they start getting worried. So we thought, we'll look at how women have to be, because women can't just be tough. They have to be, you know, tough as nails and warm as toast, as Ed Quinlan says. You have to be tough and caring when you're a woman all at once, you know, like you're a governor who loves or whatever. So anyway, we thought, okay, we'll look at the ads and see who does that well, or how women convey that. And so we got focus groups together, and have you ever seen these things where you dial to show how you're, like advertising, you dial up, you dial test to see how people are responding. So we had them respond to these women to see, you know, are they coming across well? Would you vote for them for governor? Do they look like they could be tough enough? Are they tough and balanced, whatever? Well, a couple of things happened. One is, there was one woman who could do this, and I want to mention Ann Richards again. You know, I mean, we've had so many women who could be the president, Barbara Jordan, and Shirley Chisholm, and Ann Richards, we really messed up. But Ann Richards was the only one who just could do it immediately, because she's tough and funny and caring at the same time. You know, like they asked her about crime, and she had said, you know, in Texas, if you do the crime, you're going to do the time. And it always worked. I mean, she had a way of kind of making people tough and laugh and et cetera. But for most women, you know, they didn't have a way to convey that unless there were things they did, like wear a certain kind of clothes, talk a certain way, you know, be behind a podium. See, I'm invalidating every rule I know about authority by standing here like Oprah. I'd have more authority standing up behind the podium saying, will you please learn this and I'll give you a test tomorrow. But the truth is, that is the way women get authority. On the other hand, the thing that most amazed me was that when the women actually first, when the ads first came up, because we did the women and the men, when the ads first came up, before the women said anything, people started to dial down when it was a woman. They started to dial down. When a man came up, they started to dial up before he said anything. I mean, this is what we are talking about and why it is so important that will exists. Because why women need each other and the support of each other and the authorization of each other is that the world does not authorize you. And so your colleagues have to help authorize you in a way. And that was why it was nice to be introduced by 2 people. I got authorized twice tonight. But the truth is you have to have that. The other thing I kept running up against was this whole notion of ambition. We are really still ambivalent about ambitious women. You know, if you say a man is ambitious, you know, it's like, oh, he is ambitious. But if you say Hillary Clinton, you will find out what goes on in this country to ambitious women. Because people are so focused on somebody who actually wants things, you know, who actually says, I want to do this, I want to run the healthcare thing. I mean, it's not just about the First Lady, it's that she dared to say, I can do this, I want to. Women have to mask their ambition. Men have to mask another reason that you must with each other, and I say men have to do this for women and women have to do it, you have to encourage each other's ambition. You really do. You have to set the stakes up for each other. One of the places, the pieces of research that most concerns you and really is about why Vote Run Lead was created is that the Eagleton Institute did a piece of research looking at the leadership of this country. Over half of the presidents, half the Congress, half the governors ran for office before they were 35. Ran for office before they're 35. Do you know who's in power now? Young people who ran for office before they're 35. They're 86% male, they're 81% white. There's no pipeline in young leadership. Well, guess what? How do we get that pipeline created? It's something called political ambition. It's because men actually see men in office. I mean, you're a guy, you look at the office and you say, there are men there. And usually men, when they see that, think, I could do that. I see men doing it. It doesn't, it feels normal. And that's what it's supposed to feel. But women look and they don't see women there. And so what do they say? Oh my God, the bar would have to be so high. What would I have to know to get there? I mean, my same friend Kathleen said, men wake up in the morning, look in the mirror and say, I should run for president. And many of them unfortunately do. and fortunately sometimes. But why, that's why we have 9 men and one Carol Mosley Broad out there representing us, and she did a good job. And who had to say, excuse me, I haven't had my time. I mean, the truth is, we need lots of women running for president too. But there have been used tire salesmen who ran for president. Martin Taylor sold tires, but a woman would never. We would cream her, wouldn't we? I mean, if she were a used tire salesman, my God, get out of the race. One of us would assassinate her. She would have to represent us because the whole idea of being ambitious, for one thing, as a woman, is just not. And that's one thing I want you to do for each other. Because what I know is that all it takes is that 37% of men self-identify, but guess how women do it? If I say to one of you, like, I have to find somebody, let's see, a worthy victim. No, you don't have to go yet. Have you ever thought about politics? No. Have you ever thought about politics? I knew you had. I thought so. But no, the only thing is, the reason I'm saying this is how women get in is somebody says to them, I saw that school board position and I was thinking of you. Now, the thing is, it's not that the woman doesn't want to do that, but unless somebody says it, like, I'd love to see you take that next job. Have you ever thought, you should actually be doing something different, because you've got more talent. I mean, women need more encouragement. I don't think that's great. It won't always be the case. But the way you get women in is to ask them and to encourage and invite them, because we don't like women who invite themselves. When I ran for office, I actually got invited by a woman who was on the city council. Thank God, she called me and she said, Maria, I'm getting off this council if you don't run. And I was thrilled. I would never have said, I should run for the office, But when she said, would you come? I was thrilled. Now, that's too bad, but it's the truth. And it's a good thing. Because when I went around the community and people said, what have you done? What have I done? Well, I've worked in this community for years. I've changed laws. I've helped your career. Yeah, but you have a political resume? No, I don't. But does he? I mean, the interesting thing is the bar is higher. So you have to have somebody who invites you in sometimes and says, you should run. So political ambition is really important to encourage. And it's important in high school and college because women stop leading. So we have to keep pushing women to lead. Very quickly, the area of ability. The hard thing about ability, I want to say one more thing about ambition. When we first did the White House project, the first thing we ever did was we made a straw poll of 20 women who could lead America. It was great. We put Mae Jemison, the first African-American astronaut. We put on it, lots of women from politics. We put Judith Rowe, who was the president of the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, we just took 20 women who could lead America. We didn't put Oprah because we knew she'd probably kill us. She sues you if you do this. So at any rate, we put 20 women who could lead. And my friends were furious. I mean, they were like, those women are going to be so embarrassed that you said that about them. Why? They won't want to be seen ambitiously. They won't want to be seen wanting to. Hillary Clinton was on it. Kay Bailey Hutchinson was on it. Elizabeth Dole was on it at the time. And I said, okay. So I did call these people afterwards, though. We put them on the ballot, so I called them and I said, you know, Dr. Jameson, I just want you to know we put you on a ballot as somebody who can lead America. And Marion Wright Edelman, I think Marion's been here. We put Marion on it. Marion said, Marie, I don't want to be the president. I know you don't. I just want you to be out there. Okay, so we put them on. And they were all like, oh, I see. They understood what we were doing. We were trying to change consciousness. So we put it out in Glamour, and Essence of Latino, and Jane, Parade. And it was great. People voted. They got used to voting for women. But you know what phone calls I got? Marie, why am I not on that ballot? I mean, women want to be out there. They have ambition. They want to lead. And all this crap, I mean, pardon my language, all this unfortunate literature last year about how women don't want to lead, about how women don't want to be in power, about how women want to go home and opt out. Oh, please. Women want to lead. They want to be in power. They also would like to have a decent life and a decent job, and actually a job that's kind of interesting. But it is not about opting out. You know, so I want you to remember that. Encourage it with them, and they will lead. Ability. I think the most important thing I want to say about ability is the abilities women bring right now that are so needed, and it's been proved, are the abilities, and there's other stuff about ability, but the stuff about peacemaking, bringing peace. Women have turned out to be incredible peacemakers, and not because we're such a peaceful species or anything, but again, because we are able to work across boundaries with folks. That's why the conflict in Ireland I've settled, you know that, because of women. That's who talks to each other across Palestine and Israel, women. Because women are good peacemakers, and the European Union and the UN and others are saying, put women into conflict situations because they're able to make a better job of bringing people together and of, you know, coming in. They're not the warriors, etc. Now, the warriors don't want women in peacemaking. Swanee Hunt writes about this, how when she was in Austria as the ambassador, the women from Bosnia were not sent over, and yet the women from Bosnia were the highest group of educated women around. She said, why didn't they? Well, they don't want people to compromise. Women compromise. So they don't want women, as part of the peace delegation, compromising. That's what peace is about, compromising. So you have to see the abilities that women bring. They're also 1 in every 7 people who are fighting in the war. It's not like women can't fight. They can fight, but they can make peace. Finally, authenticity. One of the things that this country is so hungry for, and so hungry for right now, again, in our companies and in our country, are authentic leaders. People who actually are who they are, who say what they think, who say it in a way that you know that's who they are. We are desperate for authentic leaders. But you can't be authentic if you aren't able to bring your whole self to the table. And that means bring every aspect of you to the table. That's what authenticity is about. And we have told men in America to leave parts of themselves out of any table, and women too, but particularly men. I am very interested in the roles of men and the lives of men changing, because I know that when men are like, I don't know how many of you saw the Fog of War, Sylvester Visitation about McNamara. Yeah, when McNamara was being asked about Vietnam in this interview they did with him for the documentary The Fog of War, one of the things he said in person and in his book is that in dealing with Vietnam, where thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands died, the war that, we're still fighting in this election, he said this, I tried so hard to keep my human heart and emotions separate from my head and my thinking. It was the saddest thing I ever heard. That's the problem. That's the problem. You can't leave part of yourself out, because war is about hearts and heads. War is about death. War has changed. War in the turn of the century was about 5% civilian casualties. World wars, that's what they were. The 100 conflicts that are being waged now are 95% civilian casualties. This is about the head and the heart. We have to think differently about war and peace and how we create it and what conditions will actually create war and peace. In our companies and in our country, we need new solutions. But we have told men to put their part somewhere else. That's the problem. And men have to be allowed, and women have to be able to bring their heads. Women can't be all nurturing and mothering, etc. As I often say, show me a woman without guilt, and I'll show you a man. Because we have made women guilty anytime they aren't doing the things that we think they should be doing. It's a country that until we have a difference in that will not be authentic. And I guess what I'd like to wind up saying is one thing at the end of the book. I was so encouraged because there were places in the world where this was changing. There are places in law firms across the country. There are places in women's leadership. Women's political leadership is changing. There are places where women lawyers are actually making deals with women in the law firms and the law offices and saying, we aren't going to do business with anybody who doesn't promote women. So things are changing in terms of how women are working together across lines, and companies are changing slowly. But I want to remind you that this is not about gender. I don't know how many of you know about megatrends, but it was a book that was written a long time ago by John Nesbitt. And what John Nesbitt said that everybody remembers is the railroad business died because it didn't know the business it was in. They thought it was in the the railroad business. And it wasn't. It was in the transportation business by then, and it had not diversified, hadn't figured it out, so it died. Well, we are not in the gender business. I'm not up here talking about just gender. I'm talking about how our institutions need to be transformed. This is a transformation business we're in, and we have to have that to do it. And I think our children have led the way. I always like to end with a story of the little girl who actually went to work with a woman. The first year we had to take our daughters to work. And every day when they do take our daughters, those who went, at the end of the day, they put the women up front and putting the companies buttoned up so they could see how many women they have in their companies. And the woman was talking about her work. And the little girl, who's about 11, who'd been following her around all day, got a chance to ask questions. And the woman said, well, what do you think? And the little girl said, I noticed your job was boring. The woman said, well, maybe a little boring. She said, well, didn't you ever want to do something else? And the woman said, yes, I have. She said, well, what'd you want to do? And the woman said, well, I have wanted to be a singer. And the little girl said, well, sing me a song. And sure enough, in front of these folks who had only seen her as this buttoned-up executive at Brooklyn Union Gas, she started belting out, memories like the corners of our minds. And I so was moved by that story because I thought, that is what children see. That is what little girls watch. They're saying, what songs have you stopped singing? What parts of yourself have you cut off to do this kind of stuff you're doing in the world? And they invite us to bring all that back in. Bring that back. Bring your songs back. And we're looking at a world that really needs, the body politic needs all of its parts. And children watch it and they know that. And they want to know these things because they know we need all of ourselves in this work. So I thank you for listening, and I'm open to your questions or comments.